Welcome back. This is video 7 in the Mapping for Mature Buck series, and today we'll be talking about the topographic hub. Topographic hubs, or wagon wheels, or spider webs as some people like to call them, are terrain features where multiple things all come together in one place on a topo map, such as drainages, ridges, and secondary ridges. You can usually find other terrain features in these locations like steep areas, thick vegetation, old logging cuts, logging roads, blowdowns. The topo hub itself is a major deer concentration area, but when combined with these other terrain features to put you in the right spot, these ridgetop hubs can really produce mature bucks year after year. These hubs can be important transition zones for bucks moving between different habitats. Bucks like to use these hubs to gather information during the pre-rut and the rut before deciding which direction to travel. Wagon wheels are pretty common in hill country, and ones that contain the elements that we're talking about in this video series are ones that you should go check out. I've zoomed back out on this piece of private land, which is roughly 58,000 acres. It's representative of much of hill country spread throughout the majority of the eastern United States. When you zoom out, I wanted to show you that hill country topographic hubs are more easy to spot. There's a topographic hub here, there's a topographic hub right here, and here's another one, and there's another one back there. I like to look for ones where the spokes of the wheel are the main ridges, and each main ridge has multiple secondary ridges going up to it. What this does is create a multiplier effect. Instead of having 3 or 4 main ridges connecting at the hub, the existence of all of these secondary ridges from each main ridge then multiplies the total number of places a buck can come up and end up in the spot you want him to be, which is at the hub. And this is the spot that we want to focus on for hunting. Usually there's some ag down in the bottoms, and even if there isn't any ag, the bottoms will typically contain some green foods or some fields behind people's houses or other forbs that deer seek out in naturally occurring bottoms. This topo hub right here sticks out to me because you have a nice main ridge system that goes off to the north and another one that goes out to the west. You also have a big drain coming up right here, and another big drainage coming up right here. And then there's a north-south running drainage over here on the east side of the hub. Now let's take a closer look at the topo hub we've picked out. Where do the majority of things come together? That'll become our focus area, and I like to try to keep that under 100 acres so I can really go in and break it down. When we're e-scouting a topo hub, I like to make educated guesses, as I do in each of the terrain features that we're discussing in this series. I want to try to figure out where the community scrape might be, and I base this on where most of the drainage and ridges come together, and also where the natural flat spots are at. When we're doing boots on the ground scouting, this allows me to remember to search those areas well, and when these spots don't contain a scrape, I delete the waypoint from the map. If a topo hub is a good place to hunt, one of these primary scrapes will be or should be in one of these locations or in multiple locations. If not, I move on to another topo hub because there's not enough here for me to hunt. So now that we've stitched all the deer trails using LiDAR from Shaded Relief Map, and the steep areas show up here from the slope angle shading that we've selected in gradient, I've put a question mark here where something shows up on LiDAR, and I've also accentuated all of the steep areas to give me a better idea of where the deer trails were going and where they might be when we put boots on the ground and actually walk this area. I decided not to accentuate this area right here because there was too many LiDAR images going down to another LiDAR logging road and I wanted to keep this area open so that we could see that on the map. These are important clues using the LiDAR and the shaded relief maps that you don't want to overlook and will want to go check out, because 9 times out of 10 these are deer trails going through the steeper areas. So let's fast forward to after we've completed our boots on the ground effort. And as you can see, the map gets pretty cluttered, and we'll want to reduce this clutter by eliminating some of the doe trails and some of the more insignificant trails where we didn't find any big signpost rubs or any heavy traffic. We've put all of the thickets on the map. We've put any blowdowns that we found on the map, any buck beds. We've put all of the more significant rubs because those are the trails that we're going to base our stand location on. I'm just zooming around here to kind of show you what we've been able to come up with, and I'm going to deep dive into this and show you what we ended up with. Previous one we learned about CalTopo and how I use it for hunting. I didn't really spend a lot of time talking about LiDAR, so I wanted to take a minute because it's an incredible feature that I've been using now for about the last 4 or 5 years. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and just a simple Google search revealed that this is a machine that sends out laser pulses. It measures the time that it takes for the reflected light to return to the receiver, and it's used for things like building, mapping the environment. It can be used to track building projects and to create 2D floor plans and also create 3D models of mines. It has a large application, but from a hunting aspect, it's part of the strategy that we've been talking about here, and I wanted to go into a little more detail about it. So we've zoomed in on our map here, and if we just move down here a little bit to the south and maybe zoom in a little bit, and again I want to stress this is private land, so there's a lot more man-made type roads and structures that man has cleared out little flat spots and things like that, and most national forest or WMA maps won't be this feature rich, but there are a lot of them with hiking trails. There's a lot of them with fields, and man has been in some spots before it became national forest. There's certainly been a lot of logging that has taken place, and those are easy to see on LiDAR maps. Now, what I want to do here is I just want to switch over to 3D, and then we'll zoom back in on this single ridge. I normally don't hunt single ridges unless I really have knowledge that a big buck lives on it and he's there regularly. Camera data would certainly tell you that, but I'll hunt them when they're part of a parallel ridge system and it's on the right side, the lee side for the rut. That's definitely something, but LiDAR really shows up well on these shaded relief maps. Some of the things that I'm looking for is there might be more subtle LiDAR that shows up on your map, but let's zoom in right here, and we can see here that either logging trucks or man made a road across, probably because this is one of the more easier spots to cross, and in hill country terrain, especially down in the bottoms, deer will cross these creeks in these more subtle areas. So a lot of times that might show up on LiDAR, but what you can see here, somebody cut a trail down through here either to collect logs, or it's private ground, so somebody might own this land and that might be a four-wheeler trail. But what's cool about it is that on our public grounds, you can find these little gaps through these bluffs and things like that that the deer are using regularly, and if they've used them for 100 years, sometimes they will actually show up on LiDAR, and I like to look for these areas. So if we look at the other side of the ridge, which would be the north side of the ridge, you can see that it comes on down here, and these yellows indicate that this might be an area that I would want to look at, because it makes a wishbone up here on top of this ridge, and bucks may cross here because their trails are much more subtle than than these areas where, you know, a lot of deer traffic are at, but that's what you want during the pre-rut and the rut. Or places like this where, you know, you've got these bucks that are traveling long distances, and, you know, they'll cross over these historic places, and when you're out there scouting, you want to look for spots like this. The boots on the ground effort has revealed some extra things that we want to take a look at here. So when I go into an area and start first mapping out every deer trail I find, looking for the clues that are usually found in hill country. The LiDAR we found on the map are big clues. The steep areas, the ends of steep areas, these gaps in steep areas where bucks like to bed, the tendencies that they have to get up high in that upper one-third so that the wind will come down and over their back and that they can see down the hill. A lot of times they'll be up above these scrapes. Sometimes it's 100 yards, sometimes it's 300 yards. What we've also done is we've walked all the edges of the thickets, and we're mapping these out using the tracker function in CalTopo. They usually are in that red color, as I said before in previous video, but if you walk the edges and then turn the colors to a different color or draw a polygon around them and delete the original track, you now have your thickets here, and that's important. We've also documented all the blowdowns that are of significance. You can document too much stuff on these maps. As you notice, I took the labels off of the logging deck and the cell tower, and I would probably take, just on my maps, the labels off of the thickets. The access, I've got, you know, how we would access it just so I can show you for this demonstration, but normally these tracks would live in Onyx, and I would use Onyx to get in and out of my stands and, you know, take some additional clutter off this map here, which is really, I'm using this as a journal. So when we first came in here, we found where the fresh scrapes or the scrapes with the biggest licking branches. Sometimes I don't care too much about whether a scrape has leaves in it or not, but if the scrape's been there a long time, because the ground will be extremely hard, especially in clay environments and up in the mountains and the hills. You know, a scrape that just has some leaves, leaf litter underneath it is probably made by a youngster, and most of the time where these very good topo hubs for the pre-rut and the rut are located will have one or more primary scrape. You know, it just depends on distance in these areas, but you know, this is several 300 yards or so between this scrape and this scrape. This sets up real nicely because here in the middle we have a triangle effect going on with this peak that rises up above really 3 natural saddles. So as we walked around, we documented all of the major play-in type rubs that I like to call them, because if it's not a major player, I usually leave it off the map to prevent clutter, but I do want all of the old signpost rubs, all of the new rubs that are on, you know, pretty nice sized cedars or hardwoods, especially the rubs that, you know, have some significant tine length or tine tick marks in the bark up high, or some of the other trees that are nearby have some rubbing on them. I also look for where all of the bucks might be bedding, so I look in the typical spots, which are kind of up high near steep stuff or near some blowdowns or some other type of terrain feature. Once I've located a couple of really good buck beds and I have some nice scrapes and quite a few rubs that this is a place that I definitely want to hunt, I try to sit down after I've mapped all this out while I'm still in the woods and try to pick out a few stand locations, and then we'll, you know, go back home and study them a little bit better for, you know, wind and thermals and things like that. But we've put these stand locations, and the wind direction that we need is the way that the arrow is pointing. So, you know, in this instance, I need a southwest wind. Up here, I need a northeast wind. So let's talk about where we might hunt in this topographic hub. If you're able to hunt in 2025 versus 2024, you would have camera data that should give you enough information on which scrape the most mature bucks visited during the pre-rut and rut in 2024. But since we don't have any camera data, I will make an assumption that all three of these scrapes are equal, so we can see how you might consider hunting in each of these locations. That's one of the main reasons I like to scout these in 1 year, hang a few cameras if the area looked promising, and let them collect additional information. I like to have that additional information to make the best decision on not only where to hunt, but when. The when could be mornings or evenings, or even an all-day sit. But the when could also mean, 24 to 26 October versus 3 to 5 November. It just depends on the intelligence you're able to gain from the camera data. Most wagon wheels offer multiple locations to hunt, allowing you to hunt them with multiple wind directions. And in case this is the first one of the videos in this series that you're watching, I like to use arrow waypoints in CalTopo because you can type in the precise bearing to orientate the arrow in the direction you need the wind to blow, be in the right spot, and remain undetected for as many sits as possible. I use the purple from north to east, a red arrow from east to south, blue from south to west, and black from west to north. And for illustration purposes, say if we have a west-northwest wind, I can quickly look at the map and know that I can only hunt the black waypoints that are orientated from the west-northwest towards the east-southeast. So for a west-northwest wind, I would type in 112 degrees to get the arrow waypoint pointed in the direction that I need for the wind. So let's take a look at this more northerly scrape. I typically like terrain features when a south-facing slope meets an east-facing slope, but this spot has a couple of challenges. This is a deep saddle, and deep saddles are difficult due to swirling winds. The deer trails are for the most part down low, and if we set up towards the bottom, there's a good possibility that the wind will swirl unless it's steady, say above 7 miles per hour, and from two distinct directions. The reason I like these spots is northwest winds are common in a lot of public hill country places in late October, and this spot sets up perfectly right here for a northwest wind. The problem is that deer trails are low. There's a saddle here below it with a scrape, and a lot of deer trails go into it, and it's a deep saddle, so up here a west, a northwest, or even a northeast wind would work here, but only up high where the steeper terrain areas are at. I would hunt here, but only as a second option. If I had one season of camera data that suggested a mature buck or multiple mature bucks were frequenting this area up high as maybe either their core area for parts of the year leading up to the pre-rut or during the rut on a few select days, I would hunt here. But since I don't have that, and the fact that the scrape and the trails are what we do have, I would rather hunt one of these other spots as my number one choice. This spot here needs a southwest wind, which are also common winds for some of the public grounds in October, but I would need to hunt lower in this particular spot. And it's not good for the morning because it'd be one of the first places to get the rising sun from the east-southeast, and the threat of thermals getting up to this bed is enough for me to want to skip this spot. It would probably be my third option for this scrape. This other spot needs a east-northeast wind. It has a steep, deep drainage, and it lies on a west-facing or southwest-facing slope and will not warm up as fast, meaning that the thermals will drop until around 9 a.m. And when the sun does get high enough to warm up the slopes, you would normally have to pack out and head home or either move up to higher ground, but with the steady 7+ mile per hour wind to overpower the thermals, you could hunt this spot all day long. Facing the setting sun to the west-southwest, it will probably be one of the last places to cool, and the thermals won't start falling until it's nearly last shooting light. So the presence of an east-northeast wind that's +7 to 10 miles per hour, which is even better, this spot could be dynamite due to the long-range protection this steep ravine provides. But without a stiff wind, you'll need to abandon it around 9 a.m. on a morning hunt, and you won't be able to hunt it on an afternoon hunt because there won't be any thermals until very, very late. This blowdown we found during scouting and the heavy LiDAR logging roads to the north tell us the majority of the deer use this path of least resistance. From the sign, we know the local does and young bucks use this to get to the ag below. The bucks from ridges above would likely follow the trails right around the head of this steep drainage with an east-northeast wind, so you're in the best spot to not only get a shot at a shooter, you're also not alerting deer to your presence. And the last element, and this is also critical to the setup, is that when you're at stand height, you are nearly even, you're only 20 feet below the elevation of the saddle above, and this needs to be the case to prevent wind swirl. If the drainage that you're hunting above was not high enough, you could be in that reverse swirl or wind tumble zone, and that would not be ideal. You want the tumble zone to occur below your setup in these scenarios, but only if you have the steep ravine behind you. Your elevation in the tree should match that of the saddle elevation, and this is one way that I roughly checked that in the 3D maps in CalTopo. You can also turn on the 10-foot contour lines, and we can see 2 lines above the stand, so we should be about 20 feet high in the stand, but I also believe that 15 feet in your stand would work as about the minimum height for success. Now let's take a look at the more westerly scrape. The red arrow needs a south or a southeast wind, but the lack of terrain features below it deters me a little. Heavy buck sign and active scrape and camera data would be needed here for me to want to make it my first hunting choice. And a slight wind less than say 5 miles per hour should also be considered here, because wind wrap could foil your plans here pretty quickly. The purple arrow to the east has a good thermal drop, but you would need to sit at the head of this drain, which is not steep enough in my opinion to prevent deer from crossing below you. Plus there's a logging road down there with a heavy deer trail on it that deer frequently travel. I don't like any deer to smell me if I can help it, so this spot would be my third choice. You can drop even lower for a stand site because it's a bowl and there's a deeper drainage down here, but lower parts of bowls are terrible for wind swirls. This other purple arrow needs a north or a northeast wind. The trails converge below the scrape and set up right on the side of this steep terrain, which is where the more mature bucks would tend to travel with a north or a northeast wind. And there are only 2 topo lines above the scrape, so as long as you hunted it about 15 to 20 feet again, you'd be okay with the steady wind. There's 2 LiDAR logging roads below you, but this would still be my number 1 spot in this location, although it's somewhat close to the scrape. I try not to sit too close to these scrapes if I can, but this is the only good spot in this location in my opinion. We would only have a thermal drop until around 7:30, but that's okay in this spot because the site's only 20 feet below the saddle elevation, and a thermal rise is what I would prefer if I had winds below 5 miles per hour. I would prefer a steady wind over 7, and thermals would not come into play. Since this spot faces the south and the west, evening thermals wouldn't drop until after sunset anyways, making this a solid spot to avoid detection if you can get in here without bumping anything off the scrape. In the best 3 spots in this topo hub, I would still rank this as my third choice, with the previous spot we talked about on the northerly scrape being my number 1 or 2. It would really boil down to what camera data was telling me and which scrape was the hottest. Now let's take a look at the last location, the more southerly scrape. This spot here to the south is high up on the ridge, making it a decent choice with a stiff south-southwest wind, but the wind would need to be above 10, and that doesn't guarantee a buck traveling below the scrape on this northeast facing slope doesn't get your wind, so this would be my last choice for this location. Milkweed could give you a better indicator, but I would pass on this spot personally. This stand site here needs a 10 mile per hour wind to overpower the thermal rise, but if you had that, this could be a sweet spot. Northwest winds are common in a lot of places that I like to hunt in October and early November, so this may be one of the spots that you have to hunt first. Only with the strong northwest wind. The buck might be in this bed above, so you wouldn't want a mediocre wind speed as he might get your thermals. This last spot needs a slight less than 5 mile per hour wind or no wind, and a good thermal to help suck your wind down into this drainage. For this reason, I would only hunt this location in the evenings, but since It faces the northeast. The thermals will drop here early by 4:30 in October and around 3:30 in November after daylight savings time takes effect. You could slip in here early enough for this spot to be a great spot on an afternoon, and with no wind or a slight southwest wind. The spot sits too low on the hill, in my opinion, for it to be effective in the mornings. So that's what we came up with for this topo hub. I plan to make some other videos of topo hubs in the future because every one is unique. There are common terrain features in hill country, and each of them present their own challenges. But if deer traffic is there and there's a lot of ridges, secondary ridges, and drainage that connect all in one spot, they should not be overlooked, because the good ones can produce mature bucks year after year. This topo hub that we broke down, the elevation was around 2,120 feet, and the bottoms were around 1,400 feet, and that's an elevation change of around 720 feet. I might try to break down a more subtle hill country topo hub in the future. And the last thing we have before we wrap up this video is a success story. On October the 28th, 2022, on a public land rifle hunt, I shot this buck on a topo hub. The topo hub set up much like this one, but it was actually inverted and didn't have quite as many of these. I think there's 12 secondary ridges that come up to this main ridge, and then this main ridge connects to an even bigger ridge. And what made this spot special was a few things. Well, about right here, just below this main ridge to the east, there was a big community scrape that had thumb-sized licking branches. The ground was very hard, the scrape was very big, so I knew this spot needed a better look, and when I looked at it on the map from zoomed out, what I realized is that this rifle hunt was going to get a lot of pressure from these ag fields down here, and there's probably 100 acres of ag fields down this bottom, and there was a road that pretty much came to a dead end right here. So I knew that any pressure I'd be getting would be from down here in these fields. It took me about an hour to get back into this spot, and I came in from this other side of to the east over here, and I popped over, and I walked out here, and I had a northwest wind that morning, so I knew I needed to be on one of these southeastern facing slopes. So what I did was I picked out a spot that was right here at the hub. It was below the scrape, maybe 150 yards. I knew the deer would be going to the scrape. I also knew that the deer would be getting pressure from these ag fields and all of these trucks and things coming down the road. So I was set up well before daylight. About 7:30, I had a buck come in, and basically he popped up over from this area and made his way. He was side hilling, so that he was on the lee side of the hill, but he was trying to get back here to bed on one of these southeastern facing slopes. So what happened was you had a couple things going on. You had the pressure from the Orange Army coming in off of these ag fields. This was opening day of rifle season in late October, and essentially I knew I would have some pressure from these fields because the road dead ended in this area right here. It would take somebody about a mile walk to get back to where I was set up, which was at this hub right here. There was a big community scrape right here just before the last hill to this main ridge that ran pretty much north and south. This topo hub essentially connected two secondary ridges here, the middle ridge of a thermal hub down here, secondary ridges over here to the north, these secondary ridges that ran along the west, and then they bend around into another big thermal hub down here. So I knew that this spot had a lot going for it because a lot of deer would cross this thermal hub. A lot of deer might be in these ag fields. A lot of deer might be getting the pressure from the public. And then we had this big community scrape that was generational. It had thumb-sized licking branches. It had this big giant rub right here that I took a picture of. And that morning I had a northwest wind, so I knew I needed to be on the southerly edge, southeastern edge of this hub. And so I got just below the hub on this side. Drop me a comment below if you have any questions or if you think there's a better stand location in this hub. Knowledge is knowledge, and I hope we can pass it on and keep the hunting heritage alive for our kids and grandkids and generations beyond. That wraps up video 7, the wagon wheel or topographic hub. If you like this kind of content, please make sure you go check out the other videos in the Mapping for Mature Buck series, and I hope you have a good hunting season.